4, 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, since the dawn of human existence, where human beings began to socialize, trade, and form institutions, there has been one thing constant despite technology changing and evolving over time. Human emotions primarily affect decision-making, and the irrationality of such primarily govern how people receive government action and economic policy, and also the people on top, who also are human, are able to play those things into account. We think these particular nuances allow the economy to be able to adjust to these particular things. I understand that theoretically, economics has a perfect answer to everything. There is an equilibrium price and perfect intersection between supply and demand. But the reality of how the world works is that is constantly dynamic and changing, primarily because of human emotions like hope, like fear, like greed, and the desire to be able to improve their life, even if it means that these particular people might maybe spend more, might not save, etc. This is primarily the lens of looking at this debate. A couple of features of our policy which we think are important. The first is, this is a value judgment debate in terms of what primary lens do we look at economics. This isn't like a false dichotomy between, objective equals natural science, subjective equals social science, because to some extent, both are important, but we need to make a very clear trade-off in terms of being able to primarily treat it and look at it in terms of the lens of social sciences. Second point, what does that mean and how does it look like in terms of primarily treated? We're referring to the crafting, the execution, and the arbitration of economic, political, and social policies. This applies in terms of microeconomics that affect the individual and the family, and also macroeconomics, the things like fiscal policy in terms of how governments spend money, the taxes that they charge to be able to collect money. That's the fiscal side. Also on the monetary policy side, in terms of how central banks are able to contract or expand the economy by virtue of taking a look at M2, or your money supply. That includes but is not limited to A, reserve requirements, B, interest rates, and C, open market operations to be able to buy and sell particular government assets. So, the trade-off that we're going to make on side government is that looking at it on the lens of social sciences primarily allows us to be able to take into account the irrationality of people on the receiving end of policy, and also people on the top, because we understand that, again, this is going to affect the micro and macro level. The comparative on their side is looking at economics through the lens of a natural science, the likes of biology, chemistry, and physics. Yes, these things are very precise. These things are very accurate. Maybe that works in the field of medicine or engineering when you're trying to cure someone and give them a proper dosage or put a building up. But when you're dealing with diverse groups of people by virtue of the birth lottery and people coming from all sorts of walks of life, people have very different ways of arbitrating how things are successful or not. And we think that the way in which governments primarily affect that should also be very specific. Again, in a perfect world, we're all smart, we don't have any cognitive flaws or emotional damage, etc., then sure, we can look at it like a perfect natural science. I'll buy this at equilibrium cost. Yes, I'll put the perfect interest rate here. I won't be able to borrow money because it's not like I can afford this particular thing. But the reality is that people, again, are irrational, especially during things like market shocks. These very individuals make really poor decisions, and in order to offset the harms of that and be able to adjust to what happens, we need to truly take into account the irrationality of people, and that gives birth to the field of things like behavioral economics, which we think is proven and tested to truly be the best way to be able to deal with people. The first argument that I'm going to give you is essentially taking a look at the birth lottery and how there are many things outside our locus of control. That is to say, people are born in terms of a spectrum. You have some people who are able to make money, some people lose money, etc. I'm still at 5 minutes, so I have 2 minutes left. This is a 7-minute speech, right? So it's primarily because of these things that we take into account a rich human history. That is to say, culture, race, religion, and ethnicity, which primarily affect the way people live their life. That means, primarily through a social lens of looking at it, we need to be able to adjust and adapt to those particular realities and be able to make specific policies. Things like Sharia courts and Sharia law, or things which are meant to be able to protect women and gender minorities, for instance, because the counterfactual or comparative underside is it's probably going to be to an extent anti-poor or anti-minority at the point in which the redistribution of very scarce resources is probably going to be meritocratically concentrated on those who are contributing, those who can grow our GDP. But the reality is that for things that they do not consent or control to, you have a lot of people who ultimately have to be helped, and that's why you have the birth of things like social welfare to be able to help those individuals, which in a nutshell, is not the most rational thing to do, because by natural law, the natural thing to do is survival of the fittest. And because we've grown and we've become more humane since then, we know that it's probably kind of bad to let these particular poor minorities and refugees be left on the wayside. The second thing, and most importantly, is the difference between equality and equity. Meaning on our side, we're able to have a more specific and unique equitable redistribution of opportunities and wealth by virtue of looking at the social realities that affect people. We're able to take into account things like the generational wealth of the 1% and the structural barriers and limitations people of color, women, and minorities face, which ultimately plague them and restrict their ability of being franchised. So, ultimately, if you want a chance to be able to allow the world to be efficient, we need to be able to take into account the irrationality of people and the emotions that drive these decisions. We are very proud to open this debate on side proposition.